Welcome back, students. Let's go ahead and begin our lesson for today. We will get into our read out loud and think out loud of our introduction to our non-fictional read titled Kids on Strike. We'll be focusing on our reading strategy of previewing the text and using conjunctions of time. So yesterday, students, we began, of course, to review over what previewing the text means. And so remember the background information given during our previous lesson. Our essential question that was asked was, what information can you learn about this book just from your previous knowledge and by looking at the image on the cover? And so, students, yesterday you had the opportunity to practice and apply your understanding of previewing the text. So, we looked at our book cover here. And so, as we looked at the book cover, students, I know I began to focus on some of those wonderful text features that were provided for us. And so one of the text features that really stood out to me was the title itself, Kids on Strike. And I know that is very important and very significant to the story. And here we have our picture. And I noticed within the picture, students, that there are, of course, kids around your age. And then I see the signs that they're holding up as they are on strike. And it's very significant as well because it's already letting me know what the topic of the story is going to be about. And I see here where on one of the signs it says, "We only ask for justice." So that lets me know this, these students, the kids your age, are experiencing injustice in their life at this time. And then I see we want to go to school. And so I know that that's, of course, one injustice that they're experiencing. They want to just go to school. And we know by law at this time and age that all students have to be in school, whether it is face to face, whether it's virtual, or whether it's homeschool. Okay. You have to be in school. But back then, that was taken from them, that right. So I can see that they're on strike and they're fighting for equality. And I want to know even beyond that, the question pops in my mind, what other injustice may they be experiencing? Well, let's see if we can find out by the introduction of our reading of our story. But before we begin to read, let's look at some background knowledge and recall what we learned from yesterday. So, Kids on Strike took place during the setting of the mid to late 1800s and early 1900s. It is a non fictional read, so we know that means it's not false, not fake. So, there are actual factual stories that were taking place from people that actually happened. And then that brings me to there were no laws that prevented any kind of abuse. So that means that children and women were not protected against any abuse from their husbands or fathers, whether it was emotional, mental, or physical abuse. There were no laws that also prevented children from child labor or exploitation. So at your age, yes, students, children were able to work. But we know at this time there are labor laws in place that will not allow for you to work until a specific age, which is normally 16 and older. Hygiene was not a big part of their daily life as well. Okay. And then the workplace injuries were very common and very ugly. And so there were minor, but there were also many serious work accidents that took place for children and women. I do want to read the disclaimer here, students, because I want you to be aware of when we're getting into reading our kids on strike. There are, like I said, injuries that will be mentioned in the story that take place while they're working, there being, of course, the kids and women. And there are descriptions here. Now, the descriptions of these injuries are mildly graphic, okay, and not so explicit or gory, but it still can be disturbing. I do also want to mention that it will get into, of course, boys working and men working here in the book of Kids on Strike as well. So let's go ahead and learn about the unfamiliar vocabulary words that you will see throughout the reading of our Read Out Loud today. Okay. Some words you may be familiar with and some words you may not, and that's okay. So keep in mind that bobbins is our first vocabulary word. And the meaning of that is like a cylinder or cone, thread, yarn, or wire. And it's usually, of course, used during or especially for weaving or machine sewing and lace making. Bobbins. Now, horticulture, a lot of times, of course, we may be able to determine the meaning of words by breaking it down and looking at the Greek or Latin root words or even the base word. And so I know most of you know what the word culture means. So let's determine what horticulture means, okay? So horticulture is the act or practice of gardening, all right? And you're cultivating and you're managing that gardening or farm life, which also took place during these times. Mutiny. Mutiny, students, is when you rebel against a higher authoritative figure. So that higher authoritative figure could be your parents or guardian. It could be a teacher. It also can be, if you were working, which they were, of course, their bosses. Okay, that is mutiny. Now, pauperism, students, I do want to tell you that is not an actual word that can be found literally in the dictionary. Okay, but once again, we can break that word down in order to determine the meaning. So let's look at pauper first because that is the actual root word. And the ism is really considered a suffix. Okay, so pauper means a very poor person. And that poor person is receiving some type of public charity or government relief. Okay. And that happened a lot, of course, during the historical times, and is still happening today, especially with our COVID, okay, depression that we're basically in. And then when you look up the suffix ism, okay, ism basically means it's a distinctive system or practice or a movement. It could be politically or it could be artistically, but it's a type of movement. And right now we understand that poverty is more higher during these times because, of course, COVID and many individuals are not at work. But even during our historical period time, of course, back then, we know that pauperism was also very, very high. So we know that pauperism basically means the system of poverty, okay, which many were impacted during that time frame and still today. Now, Fend, many of you may have known this word, of course, because you've seen it in books that you've read. Maybe you've heard someone use it before. And so, Fend is like an enemy. It's not your friend, it's a cruel person, okay? Some even refer to it as an evil spirit or demon. And so, a lot of times within the story, kids may use the word Fend to actually relate or compare to their boss, okay? Petticoat is another word that you may be familiar with due to, of course, hearing it in history or even reading about it or talking about it. And I do want to tell you that a petticoat is that light undergarment that many women and girls wore under their skirts or dresses. So let's begin to read Our Kids on Strike now that we've gone through some background knowledge, we practiced and reviewed what previewing text is, and you will continue to see that throughout our reading. And we also learned some unfamiliar vocabulary words.
Introduction. Shall we turn out? Harriet Hansen and the Spinning Room Strikers. The rows of spinning machines whirred and whizzed around 10-year-old Harriet Hansen. She watched as the cotton threads were drawn out, twisted tightly into yarn, and wound around the whirling bobbins. I can see myself now, Harriet wrote years later in her autobiography. Racing down the alley between the spinning frames, carrying in front of me a bobbin box bigger than I was. Like most of the youngest mill workers, Harriet was a bobbin girl or doffer. When the wooden bobbins were full, her job was to doff or do off the full bobbins of yarn and replace them with empty ones. Doffers had to work fast so that the spinning frames weren't stopped for too long.
All right, so students here, There is an image provided to better help you visualize exactly what the text is stating, and that's what good authors do. They try to provide as much as they can as far as text features. And so here we have an image of a young mill girl who is bending over the cylinders of cotton roving, and that's what you can see here. Okay. The cylinders are delivered to the spinning room, which is another part of the actual cotton mill where the students your age and women worked, and the weaving is drawn out and round into smaller bobbins. And so this image of illustrating the cotton weaving here is by Lowell National Historical Park.
I wanted to earn money. Harriet Hansen lived with her widowed mother and three brothers and sisters in Lowell, Massachusetts, the first textile factory town in the United States. Harriet's father had died in 1831 when she was 6, and her mother found it difficult to earn enough money to support a family. Mrs. Hansen found a job as matron of a factory-owned boarding house, and for a few years, young Harriet attended school regularly and helped her mother. My mother kept 40 boarders, most of them men, mill hands, wrote Harriet. My part in the housework was to wash the dishes, and I was obliged to stand on a cricket, a low wooden stool, in order to reach the sink. In 1835, when Harriet turned 10, she asked her mother if she could work in a nearby cotton mill. I wanted to earn money like the other little girls, she recalled. Mrs. Hansen gave her consent. Harriet was assigned as a doffer in the spinning workroom. Each day, she rose at 4:30 in the morning and washed quickly, using a pitcher of water and basin in her room. She tied up her hair and followed the older mill girls to work, down the street and across the canal. Work began promptly at 5 o'clock. Harriet and the other mill girls worked 14 hours each weekday and 8 hours on Saturdays. They had brief breaks for breakfast and dinner, and were given only 3 unpaid holidays each year: Fast Day in the spring, the 4th of July, and Thanksgiving. They worked fewer hours during the winter, when there was not as much daylight. At work, Harriet watched the older mill girls tend the spinning machines. The girls kept a close eye on the cotton thread. When a thread broke, the spinner quickly pieced the ends together.
All right, students, let's go ahead and take a moment to stop and look at our vocabulary within our context that we just read. And I'm sure most of you noticed the word consent. That was a part of our weekly vocabulary. And so let's look at how it's used in the text itself. So in 1835, when Harriet turned 10, she asked her mother if she could work in a nearby cotton mill. I wanted to earn money like the other little girls, she recalled, and Miss Hanson gave her consent. So if we look at the actual text itself, and we can, of course, read the sentence before, just practicing our context clues if we didn't know what the word really meant, we could reread the sentence again. And so when someone gives consent, students, as we should recall, it means to give permission for you to do something. Okay. So as soon as Harriet turned 10, she asked for permission, consent, to begin to work at the cotton mill, just like the other little girls around her. Okay, students, we're going to go ahead and continue to get started here. All right.
After the wooden bobbins were filled, they were delivered to the weaving room, where the finished cloth was made. Older girls and young women tended the weaving looms, making sure each bobbin was full of thread. When a bobbin was empty, the girls stopped the loom, inserted a new bobbin, rethreaded the shuttle, then started the loom again. Like the spinners, the weavers also watched for broken threads.
All right, so students, let's look here. All right. So here's Lowell, Massachusetts. And this was the first large scale planned industrial city in the United States. And for many years, it was considered a model factory town. And Historical Society, excuse me, this is where the image came from. And keep in mind, students, the city was actually built around the industrial cotton mill that was brought there. And then we also have here, students, an image that supports us understanding how the women, of course, were lining up, field, okay, ready to work in the morning time, starting their early day. And of course, you can see here women and also children.
By the end of each long workday, the mill girls were exhausted. They suffered from ringing ears, backache, sore legs, and swollen feet. Young doffers like Harriet were tired too, even though it took only 15 minutes out of every hour to change the bobbins. The doffers were forced to be on duty 14 hours a day. Harriet wrote, "It has taken nearly a lifetime for me to make up the sleep lost at that early age."
Once again, students, can you imagine getting up at 4:30 in the morning, working those long hours, not having the holidays that we normally celebrate, and beginning work at 5 o'clock? And you worked long hours. And so by the time you got home, you were, of course, extremely tired and exhausted. You had so many backaches and so many, of course, swollen feet and pains in your body. You even had ringing in your ear due to the loud factory machines that were in, of course, the mills. And keep in mind, that means that you're losing your hearing. And so they started losing their hearing. That's a sign of losing your hearing when you have ringing in your ears at such a young age.
A pleasant life. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, most of the New England mill girls were young teenage girls or unmarried women between the ages of 15 and 25. Often the daughters of Yankee farmers, they moved from surrounding farms and villages to factory towns like Lowell. Most lived in boarding houses that were owned by the factory corporations and run by matrons like Harriet's mother. The rest lived with their parents or other relatives in Lowell.
And here, students, you can see there's a picture of Winslow Homer, and it's depicting a woman winding the shuttle bobbins. And her hair was tied up to make sure that it didn't get caught up in any type of machinery. And this, once again, is a picture from our Lowell National Historical Park. And even more, a lot of times they also would have a ribbon tied in their hair to hold up their hair and make sure that it did not fall.
30 to 40 girls lived in one boarding house. 4 to 6 girls slept in one small bedroom, 2 girls to a bed. The bedrooms were crowded with the girls' belongings. Each girl usually brought a homemade bandbox, a round cardboard container that held small articles of clothing. She also owned a work dress, a Sunday dress, a shawl, 1 or 2 aprons, books, papers, writing materials, and a few treats such as candy or sweetbreads. A spare bedroom served as an infirmary. The girls ate their suppers in a large communal dining room. Boarding house regulations were strict. The girls had to agree to work for at least 12 months in the mill, give 2 weeks' notice before quitting, attend church regularly, follow curfews, and demonstrate good moral character. Otherwise, girls were fired and blacklisted. If a girl's name appeared on the blacklist, she was prevented from obtaining a job in any other mill.
So, just in case students you didn't know what the word infirmary meant, that's basically a place or a large institution where they would receive care. So it's kind of like they had like a clinic, a little small room there, where if they got hurt, they could receive care. And also keep in mind, if you don't know what blacklisted means, students, once again, the girls had, of course, to give at least 12 months of work and a 2 weeks notice. And a lot of times, 2 weeks notice is still required at jobs today. They had, of course, go to church and they had to follow the strict curfews. And they always had to demonstrate good morale character, whether someone was looking or not. And so, of course, that's one of the golden rules and one of our rules we practice here at Smith Middle School. But keep in mind, students, if the girls were fired and blacklisted, blacklisted basically means that, of course, as it says here, you're not going to get a job anywhere else. And I like that we have our context clues and they provide the definition for blacklisted. So that means that it doesn't matter where you go to another state, another city, the word has traveled and you're not going to be able to get a job at another mill. And that was one of their trades. That's what they understood and knew and learned how to do. And so that was devastation for them.
Despite the restrictions, Harriet noted, it was a pleasant life. The mill girls formed close bonds and even began improvement circles so that they could study literature, science, and religion. They kept diaries and journals. The older girls taught the younger girls and told them stories. In the evenings and on Sundays, the girls read books from the circulating libraries and attended lectures, plays, horticultural shows, and concerts. Eager to dress in the latest styles, they enjoyed shopping, and they bought new dresses, shoes, shawls, and hats. They happily discarded their farm clothes. Many mill girls were excited about their new opportunities. For most, it was the first time their labor was considered important enough to earn money. Some sent money home to help pay farm mortgages, send brothers to college, or support widowed mothers. Some also saved their money to pay for their own education, dowries, or to buy things for themselves. Harriet, like many others, took pride in her work and her wages. She wrote, "How proud I was when my turn came to stand up on the bobbin box and write my name in the paymaster's book."
I think we all feel that way when we receive a paycheck.
Naturally, I took sides. When the mills first opened, the girls seemed contented. The factory owners and investors were also contented with the mill's huge profits. As time went on, more mills were built throughout New England. Soon, economic conditions changed as the competing textile mills produced more and more cloth. In order to sell the cloth, the mill owners lowered the prices, which reduced their profits. Although the mill owners continued to prosper, they missed their huge profits. They sought ways to make more money. They forced the girls to speed up their work and to tend as many as 3 or 4 looms. Bonuses were paid to overseers, whose workers turned out the greatest amount of product. Some overseers forced the girls to work on empty stomachs because they thought the girls would work harder.
Once again, remember, there are no laws that are protecting, of course, students your age, kids, from those labor, um, of course, hardships. And so, with that being said, the girls are being forced to work more hours on empty stomachs. And so, that, of course, impacts their health as well as their ability to work efficiently. And so, that means that, of course, accidents rise. So, those work conditions are causing accidents to happen because they're tired and they're exhausted. And so, injuries are happening within, of course, the mill. Okay. And then that means that, of course, if the mill owners are continuing to prosper but losing those huge profits, then what do you think is going to happen to their wages? Okay. So that's something to think about. So, students, here you can see actual images once again from a National Historical Park. And this is Joseph Bartoletti. Now, each night, dinner was served here in these large dining rooms. And the girls, of course, complained that they had to gulp down their meals very quickly, not just at night, but even during their break time in the morning when they would get breakfast. So they would have about 30 minutes to actually walk from the mill to where they would go to eat their breakfast and dinner, which is back at their housing lodges. And so they would have to be able to get to back to where they reside and live to eat breakfast within 30 minutes, eat their breakfast, and then turn around and hurry up and walk back to work and be there on time. And the same with their dinner at night. They had to hurry up and get to bed. So they were forced to eat very quickly. And so, of course, that wasn't fun at all. And then here, there's an image of how the crowded bedrooms were. And you can see basically the beds are on top of each other. And there's other furniture pieces there. And there's really nowhere to walk or kind of to stretch. And they're using every part of their space efficiently. You can see under the beds is where they have some of their suitcases stored. And so for 4 to 6 mill girls shared that crowded bedroom. And of course, they had the curfew bell ringed at 10 o'clock. And that means that all lights were out. There was no talking. There was no movement. You had to go to bed. And that is the same bell that rang in the morning time. And so each lodging room actually, or sleeping quarters, they had their morning bell ring, and you can hear all the morning bell ringing at the same time, no matter where you were. So you knew it was time to get up.
For many girls, it was no longer a pleasant life. In 1834, when the mill owners announced a cut in wages, the mill girls organized. They gave 2 weeks' quitting notice and withdrew their savings from the banks. The mill owners fired one of the strike ringleaders. As she left the mill office, she waved her hat as a signal. 800 mill girls turned out in response. During the short strike, the girls had little support. In Sunday sermons, ministers preached that the girls should return to work and be grateful for their jobs. Newspapers also criticized the strikers. The mill owners advertised for replacement workers. After a few days, the girls gave in and returned to work at reduced wages. The strike leaders were fired.
So as you can see, students, they were trying to fight for their rights. And if you participated in that strike, then you were fired. And as you can see, a result of what we talked about as far as the profits being lost, huge profits, and the lowering of the merchandise prices, that impacted the girls, the workers, and the women. So their wages were reduced.
The mill girls knew they had to stick together in order to defend their rights. They organized the Factory Girls Association. Within 2 years, the association grew to 2,500 members. In 1836, 1 year after Harriet Hansen began work at the mill, conditions worsened once again when the factory owners raised the cost of living at the boarding house with no increase in wages. The room and board hike amounted to a 12.5% reduction in the girls' pay. The mill girls were outraged. They elected leaders to speak to the factory owners. When the owners refused to negotiate, the girls planned a strike. I worked in a lower room, said Harriet, where I heard the proposed strike fully. Naturally, I took sides with the strikers. The prospect of a strike frightened many workers. Would they lose their jobs? How would they survive without any money? What would happen to their families who depended on their wages? How could mere mill girls fight powerful factory owners? How would it look for girls to protest?
And so you have to keep in mind, students, that the women and girls were not getting support of the newspapers. Most of the time, of course, the newspapers were ran by males. And so, of course, the women here are working in strenuous conditions, and that helped bring money to the household. And those household wages were very dependent upon. And so, if they're losing their jobs, then that causes, of course, stress and abuse in the home from the husbands and the fathers. And so, you have to consider all that's going on at this time. And if you were caught, of course, being a part of a strike leader, then as you know, you were fired. And now their wages is being decreased even more. Okay. And so the room and board, of course, amounted to a 12.5% reduction in the girls' pay, which supports that tax evidence, showing that their conditions worsened. Okay. And so they had a right to be concerned about, of course, going on strike and being frightened as a result of what would happen. Would they lose their jobs? And I'm sure it's hard to survive without that amount of money that they were making.
To others, the prospect sounded exciting. Their work and wages had given them confidence and a sense of independence. They were the daughters of free men. Like their Yankee grandmothers and grandfathers, they were prepared to defend their rights. The girls assured the other workers that they could stand up to their powerful employers. One worker's voice was not strong enough, but an association of workers would be powerful indeed. Shall we turn out?
Okay, students. So here we have two images. One here is the hundreds of looms that clanked and clanged in the weaving room for 10 to 14 hours a day. And so this goes back in supporting why many of the workers, the women and girls, were hearing ringing in their ear. Can you imagine hundreds of loomed machines clanking very loudly, okay, and clanging? And so when the looms movements became synchronized, the entire mill trembled. And so it began to fall apart, okay? And here's another image here. A mill owner sought more profit. The girls were forced to speed up their work and tend 3 or 4 looms. So once again, if you're working at that amount of speed and that amount of time, the conditions for your work environment changes, but also the conditions of the workers change. And so once again, they're tired, they're stressed, they're having more injuries that are occurring at the work because they're trying to manage more machines. And it's not enough women on machines and girls on machines as they're being fired and losing their jobs.
When the day of the strike arrived, the older girls and women who worked in the upper rooms of the mill turned out first. The spinners who worked in Harriet's room hesitated. They saw the strikers, but they were scared. No one wanted to be the first. Finally, 11-year-old Harriet made up her mind. I don't care what you do, she said. I am going to turn out, whether anyone else does or not. And she marched out the door. Once outside in the mill yard, Harriet became aware of the spinners behind her. As I looked back at the long line that followed me, Harriet wrote later in her autobiography, I was more proud than I have ever been since at any success I may have achieved.
So, students, we're going to come to an end at this time for us our introduction read to Kids on Strike. But can you imagine what she was feeling? Possibly you can relate to a personal experience or maybe someone else's personal experience that was shared with you, or maybe you've read a related story or text. That's amazing for her to be that bold and have that much courage to walk out of that mill and fight for her rights, going on strike and making such a grand impact that there were many lines of followers behind her, an 11-year-old, not a grown adult. And so that's definitely amazing. So, students, before we end for today, we're going to look at the use of conjunctions of time. And so I'm sure you might be wondering, what is a conjunction? Well, conjunction means a word used to connect clauses or sentences or to coordinated words in the same clause. So some of you may look at it, conjunctions being known as transitional words in a sense, or combining words. So let's look at our read here. After the wooden bobbins were filled, they were delivered to the weaving room, where the finished cloth was made. Older girls and young women tended the weaving looms, making such sure each bobbin was full of thread. And when a bobbin was empty, the girls stopped the loom and inserted a new bobbin, rethreaded the shuttle, and then started the loom again. So now we're going to look at our conjunction words that we can use for our sentence stems A and B. And we're going to fill in the blank with the correct conjunction to, of course, connect the words or the clause. So the word choices here that we have is before, after, when, and while. And you're going to use your evidence here from the text to help you choose the correct word. So you're basically kind of putting it in order in a sense, like sequence of events. So sentence A here says blank, a girl inserted a new bobbin, she rethreaded the shuttle. And then sentence B here says blank, a girl rethreaded the shuttle, she blanked. Okay. So you're going to choose the correct words to use, and then you're going to choose the correct word phrases or words here from the text that needs to be applied also in sentence B. Okay. So I'm going to give you a moment or two to look at that and see if you can determine how to properly use the conjunction and pull in evidence from the text to complete the end of the sentence for part B. All right, students, hopefully you have determined and figured out which conjunctions you would use. And also in part B, in our second blank space, what evidence from the text would you use for as the phrase to complete that sentence? So let's look at it here. I can see here that there are some clue words that I'm going to be looking at. And so that's the area where I'm going to go to. It says a girl inserted a new bobbin. Well, I see inserted a new bobbin. And I see where it says rethreaded the shuttle. Rethreaded the shuttle. So let's see what goes here in order to make the sentence correct. Which conjunction? So would I say before, after, when, or while? Okay. So looking here in this order, it seems that it would basically be the correct word. After a girl inserted a new bobbin, she rethreaded the shuttle. So you have to insert the new bobbin first. That's why we're using after and not before. Okay. And then will and while would not be correct. B, blank a girl rethreaded the shuttle. She what? Okay. So what would go here? Looking at our sentence structure and putting it in sequential order using the correct conjunction word, students, you should basically have chosen before a girl rethreaded the shuttle, she inserted a new bobbin. Okay. So in order to rethread the shuttle, you have to, of course, insert a new bobbin. So before you do that, before it goes here for your conjunction, and you took out the actual sentence evidence here, evidence from our text, to have inserted a new bobbin. So what's next, students? Now that we have completed, of course, our read out loud and think out loud, you're going to go ahead and complete the discussion post that's in our folder for today. You will also complete any other activities in your Schoology folder, and you should be on part 2 of your interactive reader as well. So make sure that you go and follow along with your second part of your interactive reader for today. And keep in mind, if you have not completed your grade diagnostic mid-year assessment, you have until the close of today to do so. Thank you for your time, and you all have a great day.